Hello and welcome to Risk Chats with AFERM. I'm your host, Paul Marshall. Today we're speaking with three guests about a brand new book that is coming out in the AFERM ERM world called Public Sector Enterprise Risk Management, Moving Beyond the Basics. So we'll be speaking with Cynthia Vitters, Sean Vineyard, and Ken Fletcher. So let's start the show. Hello and welcome to the podcast. So today we're discussing a new book that's coming out in the ERM world, and we have three of our folks in the community that help put this together in our AFERM community. So let's start off by introducing everybody. So we have Sean Vineyard here.
Hi, thank you. I'm Sean Vineyard, and did you want us to?
Yeah, give a little background. Go for it.
Yes, my name is Sean Vineyard. I'm managing director for 11th Hour Service and lead our public sector practice.
Okay, and Ken?
Hi, Ken Fletcher. I'm heading my own consulting company, focusing on public sector, ERM, federal government clients, having retired from federal service as the Chief Risk Officer at the Transportation Security Administration.
Great, and we have Cynthia Vitters too.
Hi, my name is Cynthia Vitters. I currently serve as Managing Director for Deloitte, where I lead the Enterprise Risk Management practice for GPS.
Okay, well, so let's start off. How about Ken? Why don't you give us a little of the basic information, the name of the book, when it's coming out, some of the key pieces about that.
So the book is titled Public Sector Enterprise Risk Management, Advancing Beyond the Basics, and the title is somewhat descriptive of what we were trying to accomplish. Many organizations are at the point where they've got the basics down. The artifacts, as I would call them. They have a policy document, they've got a maturity model, things from the ERM playbook. But organizations, particularly government organizations, are inherently resistive to change and adopting new approaches. And so, this is our focus of this book is really some ideas and theories about how federal and other public sector entities can overcome those organizational cultural barriers that really impede ERM from reaching a mature level where it starts adding value to the organization, rather than an investment of time, people, and other resources to stand it up, which before it can really get to the point where it's adding both tactical and strategic value.
Right, and so why did you all think this was a good time to write this book?
Well, the idea actually came up as we were having lunch at the 2017 AFERM Summit. Tom Stanton, who's the co-editor with me on the book, were chatting, and Tom had written an earlier book with Doug Webster that came out a number of years ago that was really focused on the basics, introducing ERM concepts to both risk practitioners within government, but more importantly, policymakers and folks that weren't necessarily associated and familiar with ERM. And so chatting with Tom during lunch and reflecting on many of the breakout sessions and some of the plenary speakers, he said, I think there's an appetite to refresh and move beyond where we had left the last book. Would you be interested in going in on that project with me? And
right.
So I'd never gone down the let's write and edit a book road before. So I said sure, not knowing what I was getting into. And it really built, the theme of the book on culture really built off of that theme that was kind of woven through many other presentations and breakout sessions at the 2017 summit.
Right, and there's quite a few authors involved, right? So it's not just the three of us in the room here, right?
Yeah, we have, most of the chapters are co-written by several individuals. We have a series of case studies in the beginning of the book, and then following on with a number of select special topics of keen interest to, I think, the federal and public sector ERM community. Frank Vitrano and Jason Stoyanovich wrote a chapter on their experience in establishing and overcoming some of the cultural challenges at the Federal Housing Administration. Ken Phelan and Karen Weber from Treasury contributed a chapter on their experiences and how they were able to embed ERM as part of Treasury's internal culture.
Right.
And Jennifer Hills and Sean Cantonazzi from King County, Washington contributed a chapter on their experiences in implementing ERM, what motivated them to move forward with ERM in King County, and why the county government and county council were accepting of taking this step to introduce something that quite frankly wasn't very common amongst any level of governmental organizations. So special cases, and then we have a number of select special topics, and we can talk about those
right.
later.
Well, yeah, we actually had Jennifer on the podcast, so go back and look for that one. It's a really interesting case study. King County is I like what they're doing with the ERM out there.
Yeah.
Why don't we do that? Why don't we dive into some chapters? Who wants to go first? Point in different directions.
So really the chapter that I supported is enhancing capabilities and culture through effective coordination of enterprise risk management and internal control. So about as long as a title as you can get. But really the driving force behind this chapter came from one of the first instances was when AFERM set up the Ask the Experts panel, which I've supported I think 2 years or so now. Mm-hmm. When we first opened that up, we got a flood of questions.
Yeah.
And I would say, not exaggerating, 60% of them were in some way or some form related to what's the difference between ERM and internal control. If my ERM program is coming from the CFO community, how do I make sure that they're unique and distinct? So a lot of questions concerning sort of just how the two work together.
Right.
So what we did last year is, through our efforts with the AFERM Summit, is we actually had a dedicated session, and we were thankful enough to have Nahala and April from NIST lead that session to kind of sort of spearhead some initial detailed discussion on how NIST specifically addressed that integration or coordination of ERM and internal control. So it was really well attended. People loved it, and thankfully we were kind of already on the path to this book, but I think we got so many inquiries afterwards and thoughts on how much they enjoyed that and how much people would love some more detail, that I think it kind of fueled the fire for the need for this chapter. And so when Ken had approached me about the book and we had discussed the topic, I was thrilled that we had this avenue to really provide that detail to both the ERM and internal control community.
And this is a real pain point amongst the federal community.
Right.
A123 and the playbook talk to the integration of ERM and internal controls, but there is absolutely no practical guidance on, or even a real explanation as to what does it mean to integrate.
Yeah.
And the diagram in the playbook, the little circle diagram, kind of reflects, internal controls as a subset of the ERM program, and that's the way many people think about it. So this chapter, I think, really helps answer that question in a way that hasn't been answered before.
Right.
What does it mean, and what are some of the pitfalls that you should be mindful of as you're going down that integration road?
Right.
Yeah, and I think that point that Ken makes, that was one of the driving factors is, and it's no fault to policymakers or anyone. I mean, OMB, with not having any sort of concrete legislation that supported ERM, and we still are lacking that today, is, they released it through OMB Circular A123, which was what they had to do to get this done. They got guidance out there, so no one's faulting them, but I think because of that sort of began the stem for what's caused some of the confusion, because that's inherently a CFO organization's guidance. Right? And so that, I think, has led to some of the confusion. It's there now. We're working to coordinate and kind of collaborate so people can create those unique programs. And so again, when Ken had approached me and said, okay, well, I think this would be a great topic, and we also need to discuss the impacts on organizational culture and performance. I immediately thought of a good friend of mine, Quimby Kaiser, who leads KPMG's People and Change practice, and she's just a brilliant person when it comes to organizational culture. And so when her and I first started talking, I was actually shocked to figure out how important the integration and coordination of the two programs were in improving organizational culture and performance. And so the goal of this chapter is really focusing on sort of the practical applications to effectively coordinate and potentially integrate, if you choose to do so, ERM and internal control activity. And so the goal of the chapter is really to provide readers with a way to simplify sort of a seemingly complex undertaking in order to improve overall capabilities, outcomes, organizational culture. And so it does that by kind of breaking down the purpose of ERM and internal control, really trying to clarify what is unique and what's not, going into really a more comparison of sort of the critical elements of each of those programs so people can better understand where there's overlap and where there's some of that uniqueness. Understanding some of the role that integration and coordination plays in the advancement of organizational culture. And then actually providing some coordination techniques. How can you get started as an organization to actually coordinate or integrate these two programs? And then, like Ken was mentioning, we do present some considerations for people to take into thought prior to coordinating or integrating. Some of them are pitfalls, but just things to make sure you're aware of these things prior to getting into this effort.
Yeah, just anecdotally, I'm curious. Do you guys see out there the agencies that start their ERM programs with the CFO maybe do a better job at this, the ones that don't? Because it's just, they may own the internal audit or the A123 review team, or I don't know, just throwing it out there, but what have you guys seen?
I think I've seen a mixed bag for the most part. It honestly depends on leadership. It depends on so many factors, because I've supported large organizations that it's in the CFO community and it's very well integrated, and then inversely I've supported some that it's not.
Right.
There's instances like Nahala and April that theirs is a different organization and they work together brilliantly.
Very well, right.
Well, and I think what's interesting, I would agree with you, Sean, it is a complete mixed bag, but it comes down to a lot of the cultural pieces of the organization that existed. And I mean, I've seen the same thing, but oftentimes when there's a strong culture of risk or understanding of risk, it's helped that alignment happen. I'm sure your chapter talks about that, but it is kind of that baseline.
But there's really kind of two schools of thought. One is integration can happen and it can be beneficial to both ERM and internal controls. And there's another school of thought that there should be no integration, that even if the two programs report up to the same agency executive, that there needs to be a Chinese firewall placed between. There shouldn't be any sharing and transfer of information across that artificial boundary, because it will contaminate either the internal controls view or the ERM view. And I finally, quite frankly, I don't understand the rationale behind creating that separation, because it breeds competition that's not healthy, and it breeds inefficiency within the organization. Rather than sharing approaches and thoughts, keeping them separate doesn't make any sense to me. So I think A123 has it right when it says you need to integrate. Now that's been reinforced by, Appendix A that talks very specifically about the need for integration. But you have to be careful about what you do. ERM can't become an internal controls program, and internal controls shouldn't become an ERM program. They need to remain in their separate lanes, but there's huge opportunities for synergy between the two.
Yeah, and I think actually in writing this, in this chapter, I was consulting actually with Tom Brandt, and I think he said that's what's been some of the confusion that he's seen as well, is that integration, people are taking that sometimes almost too literal, right? Saying, by integrating, these have to be one and the same, which is not the case. Okay. So, and it's funny because actually the title was initially focused on integrating ERM and internal controls, and we actually shifted to coordinating ERM and internal control because of that confusion, right? So I think that was something that was important to stress, is the interpretation of integration does not necessarily mean this has to be one in the same program, because they are unique.
Okay, well, Cynthia, why don't we talk a little bit about your chapter?
Great, thank you, Paul. So, title of my chapter, our chapter, Cultivating and Measuring Culture Risk to Achieve Forward Momentum on ERM. So another mouthful. And just, I mean, I guess backing it up, a little bit of background with the book itself and the topic of the book. And I remember that lunch, Ken, that we were all sitting at the round table. And I remember thinking, just going back to my days at Federal Student Aid, I mean, I was helping support and implement and, lead that program for a duration of what was 12 years, which is actually a really long time to be in one agency, kind of watching what was going on. And, I just remember thinking that, culture is such an important component. And when I thought about the things that I saw over a period of 12 years of time around seeing the change in culture that occurred over that time as it related to supporting enterprise risk, but also just in the very beginning thinking about the topic. And it was kind of like, would talk about ERM as a change management initiative, and people would go like, what are you talking about? And they just had no idea. And I think that as we get to where we're at today, there's so much learning from that, but also, even that culture has changed where people now do understand how much of a change management initiative it is. So I just remember being really excited about, the topic and the book and how it applied to that whole setting. And so just kind of the backstage. But then when we talked about, what would make sense as far as a contribution of a chapter, we talked about, thinking about it from a more formalized approach, and are there ways that we can really look at how we measure that? And so, a lot of the gist of our chapter is around measurement, but, just a little bit of the flavor. We start off just talking about what is culture risk. So, and I think that's great because every time we talk about ERM, everyone has their different idea of what it is. And I'm sure as we read this chapter, we might see different themes of what people define as culture risk. I don't know. We'll see how it all comes out. And then, we talk a little bit about why is it important? And that gets into, some of the things I've talked about, even though chapter isn't a case study. It's just, why is it so critically important that we think about this when we think about risk management programs? And, there's always been thought about how much it's like a core component of the base of it. But I think even today, it's a core component of the base, but we went off and did all these things, and now we're coming back and reflecting and saying it's so important to make things work. And then we get into how we manage and measure culture risk, and we do put forth kind of an organized approach around how one might do that. And, just to give you a preview, it is a culture risk framework. So just like there's an enterprise risk management framework that is out there, we also put forth an idea of, if you want to really get into the measurement and kind of get in the weeds of this, you can put forth and, use a framework to look at it. And then we talk a little bit about just where we go from here. And so, that's kind of the gist of what the chapter's about.
Great.
So.
Well, and I'm sorry, so I think, did you mention there's the cultural risk and risk culture? That's two different things. Is that right?
Yeah, and you will see a little bit of that discussion
Okay.
in the chapter. Yeah,
Interesting.
which
All right,
is
well, we'll leave that as a suspenseful item for
that
you
can,
guys
that
to
can be
read
the
about.
that can be the suspense.
Okay, well, why don't we wrap it up with Ken? Give us a little about your chapter, and then maybe hit on any other chapters that we didn't talk about.
So you write about what you know, right? So my case study was on how we got to enterprise risk management at the Transportation Security Administration. And unlike many organizations where it came from the internal controls financial services world, TSA came from our core operational passenger and baggage screening function. And was fortunate to be a part of the group that moved the agency from one size fits all to risk-based security. TSA pre-check, as most people think about that today. And the lessons that we learned, that was a huge transition for not just the agency, but for the transportation industry and for federal government. There was so much of what had been, of that one-size-fits-all philosophy that was embedded in the National Strategy for Transportation Security, National Strategy for Counterterrorism, Combating Terrorism Travel. All of these documents and approaches for more than a decade were based on anybody can go bad, and therefore everybody needs to be treated essentially the same way. And so the lessons that we learned and many of the approaches that we took to change the culture of the operational component of the agency for passenger screening, we imported over to our efforts for standing up the ERM program. And so it was really success in TSA PreCheck that led the agency leadership at the time to say, how do we take this risk philosophy and expand that to everything that the agency does, both on the mission operations as well as the business operations side of the house. And ERM was a great framework to work with in order to be able to do that. And so the focus of the chapter, beyond a little bit of the history, is the elements of change that we developed and used for TSA PreCheck, and how we were able to leverage those approaches as we began to implement the Enterprise Risk Management Program. And so what's interesting in most of the chapters, and mine included, and Sean talked about it, as well as to Cynthia, the book has an interesting mix between real-world practical experience and kind of thought leadership on some of these topics, and theory. Here are real-world, the culture change or risk culture model. Sean has embedded the Burke-Litwin change management model. I introduce kind of a 4-quadrant approach to addressing the elements of change in my chapter. So every chapter has a really good, interesting mix of theory as well as practical experience and practical application.
I think that's what people want to see. Nice theory, but how does this work?
Exactly.
Can you show me how this works? I think that's awesome. Well, did you want to touch a little bit on the chapter from Bob Westbrook?
Yes, so Bob Westbrook is the Inspector General for Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation, and the relationship between the external audit and inspections community and the ERM program is a hot topic, was certainly a hot topic when we were talking about the book. I don't think that that's changed much in the last several years. Agencies are really hesitant to give their risk registers and their, beyond whatever they're going to submit to OMB as their formal risk profile, but the nuts and bolts behind that. They don't want to give that to the IG or the GAO because that presents the shopping list for the upcoming fiscal year of, here's my pain points, come in and help inflict pain on me in these areas. So how do we begin to change that relationship from adversarial to collaborative? And Bob was really a leader in that thought process within the IG community. And so we asked him to write a chapter that he calls Working with the IG and GAO, Creating a Win-Win Relationship. And this is some really interesting thoughts about how the two organizations can work collaboratively together to improve the risk management environment of the organization and their ability to achieve their goals and objectives while remaining independent and respectful of the independence that the IG and the GAO community have.
Right.
And so I think it really provides some great food for thought about how to move beyond. IG can be a great resource for a CRO who's having difficulty in overcoming some of the internal cultural barriers. The IG community can be a great resource to a CRO and a CFO on how effective the ERM program and the internal controls program are independently, but as importantly, how effective is the integration of those two programs.
Right.
And so I don't think CROs and risk functional managers in government typically look to the IG and the GAO as an ally and a resource, but they can be, and Bob presents a way to kind of flip the switch in how to think about that relationship.
Okay, well, you guys definitely gave us a great overview of the book. Really just a couple questions left. I mean, I think I know the answer to this one. It's everybody listening right now, but who's the intended audience, would you say, for this book? Who would get the best benefit here?
Well, we wrote it with the federal ERM community primarily in mind, because most of the contributing authors came from that community. But we included the public or the county chapter, King County, Washington chapter, because not only does it provide good, interesting insight for the federal ERM community, but it makes the book directly applicable beyond the federal government to county, local, and state governments. And they're all resource constrained, and in fact, they can't run deficits like the federal government. I think governors have to balance their budgets every year, right? So how do you focus those limited resources on the areas that are most important? And ERM can help. And then as we were talking to our publisher, Rutledge, the part of that conversation came around to, well, this, the content in the book, because of the mix of theory and application, really makes a potential good text for an academic course in risk management or enterprise risk management. And so we think there's multiple audiences: academia, the federal government, and then the state, local, and county government practitioners.
Great. Well, I mean, really, I just want to know now is, when is this book coming out and where can we find it?
So the preliminary is already out. The advance notice. The book will be published in May. I'm told early to mid-May it will be out. It should be available on Amazon at that time.
Awesome.
In both hard copy and soft copy form.
Oh, we need an audiobook now, right? I should record one, right? All right. Well, yeah, thanks everybody for joining us. Sean, Cynthia, Ken, I really appreciate it, and I'm looking forward to seeing the book.
All right, thanks, Paul.
Thank you, Paul.
Thanks for joining the show. Visit our website, AFERM.org. You'll see all our other podcasts. And be on the lookout for the new book. If you go to Amazon.com, you can pre-order it today, actually. So, yeah, it'll be available wherever you buy your books. So, until next time, this is Paul Marshall signing off for Risk Chats with AFERM.